Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this virtual rapid response event being put on by Perry Worldhouse at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm Marie Harf. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the executive director here at Perry Worldhouse. And we are very lucky to be joined by three outstanding panelists today who were able to do this in pretty short notice. And of course, all of you joining with only a couple days notice, but a lot to talk about certainly on day 4 of the war that the US and Israel launched on Iran on Saturday. So I'm going to introduce the three of them. We'll have a conversation and then we'd love to take your questions. So please put questions in the chat function and I can see them and I will ask as many of them as I can get to. So I will start with our first panelist. Khamenei is a non-resident senior advisor at Perry Worldhouse. He was a visiting fellow last year, and he's associate professor of international studies in the Hamilton Lugar School of Global and International Studies at Indiana University. He does work on the U.S. and Iran relationship, has written or co-written several books about the topic on democratic theory, diplomatic theory, Iran's political development, a whole host of very relevant issues for today's conversation. And for those of you who are fans of the Higher Learning podcast, I know there are a lot of you out there. He was on today talking about Iran, so check it out. Dalia Dasakay is a senior fellow at the UCLA Berkel Center for International Relations and director of its initiative on regional security architectures. She is an internationally recognized expert on geopolitics and Middle East policy. She spent 15 years at the RAND Corporation, serving as director of their Center of Middle East Public Policy and as a senior political scientist. In very exciting news, she has a new book out called Enduring Hostility, The Making of America's Iran Policy. Again, very relevant for today's conversation. And later this spring, we'll be hosting her actually at the University of Pennsylvania for a book talk. So for those of you who are in Philadelphia, please join for that. Dan Schneiderman, last but not least, is the director, newish named director of global policy programs at Penn Washington. So for those of you familiar with our outpost in Washington, D.C., he's leading our global work there. He is a longtime veteran of various U.S. government agencies, including the Department of Defense, where he worked on a number of issues, including Afghanistan, the State Department, where we actually work together, the National Security Council. He's worked on counterterrorism, Yemen. He's also been at organizations such as the International Crisis Group. And all of us have been out over these past 4 days talking about these issues with different media outlets, but really we were excited to do so with our community here at Penn. So thank you for joining. I'm really grateful for the conversation. I'm just going to start by asking each of you 4.5 days into this war to give your thoughts, whatever thoughts those are about any piece of it, about where things stand today. As someone myself who has worked on Iran for a long time, 15 plus years now, I believed that military action was coming. I thought the Trump administration had just moved too many military assets to the region. They had not really given a lot of weight to the diplomatic process that they were allegedly engaged in. But I even was a little surprised at the breadth of the strikes, at the immediate killing of the Supreme Leader of Iran, and have been very curious at some of the shifting objectives given over the past 4 days. On Saturday, President Trump talking about regime change, saying this is the moment for the Iranian people to rise up and take over their government. And now we're hearing from administration officials talking about much more military focused objectives and less about regime change and democracy. So, Huss, I'll start with you. Your thoughts sitting here at 3:05 p.m. Eastern Time on Tuesday about this war that has started over the weekend.
Thank you. And it's a privilege to be on this panel along with Dalia and Dan and you, Marie. I think, like you said, have been tracking this tortuous live conflict, I'm sure like everyone else on this panel. I would divide my impressions on the kind of military side and maybe the political slash strategic side. On the military side of this, I think there was never any doubt that the United States military, especially combined with Israeli military, were going to have much difficulty overwhelming the Iranian defenses, and the war has progressed very much along those lines. I think it's very clear now the timing of the start of the war had a lot to do with the gathering of the senior leadership at the Supreme Leader's compound. So it's interesting that that was the trigger that started the war, not an imminent threat to anyone. So there was a strategic opportunity that Israel and the United States took to take that war. And I would guide everyone's attention to a fascinating piece in the Financial Times yesterday that really detailed the intelligence work that went into that operation specifically that commenced the war. So on military side of this, I think we're seeing things play out pretty much as most experts had thought it would play out, that Iran would also hunker down and try to absorb some hits, but really try to expand the war immediately to start putting pressure on Washington by attacking especially the Arab Gulf monarchies. And Iran has done that exactly to a T. How much longer it could go on doing this, that's something to monitor. The president said that the military operations are ahead of the schedule. I would assume that they're very pleased with the success they're having, and I think that checks out with when you look at the daily bombardment, how many sorties they've been able to fly over Iran without much resistance. So militarily, everything is, I think, very much on an expected plane, and that's what you would expect from a superpower in a war theater like this. Strategically, I think the incoherence with which this war was being pursued from the end of the last war in June, the 12-day war, to where we are today, that incoherence is still very much with us. And in fact, I think it's beginning to really compound because now there's major military operations taking place. Exactly what the objectives are beyond eliminating all of Iran's defenses, forget its nuclear program. Collapsing the regime is something that the president was very excited about when he announced the beginning of the war. He's now walked that back a little bit and is talking about, how he was displeased with the direction of the talks, etc. What would constitute success? He gets asked this question repeatedly in the press conferences that he's given. And to my ears, I've yet to hear a convincing case of what success would look like and what U.S. planning for that eventual scenario might be. So it's a very strategically incoherent, to be charitable, incoherent war so far. And I would add one other dimension that I'm tracking here is that I think it's very clear that the belligerents in this war are beginning to have different sets of strategic objectives. I think Benjamin Netanyahu and Israel would have been really happy if this war had taken place the way it is right now back in June. And they are pursuing regime change. They would like to see that scenario come about. And Arab Gulf monarchies, I think, are fence sitting. They like to see and weakened Iran, not necessarily one that has a government that could really rebuild it and make it a major regional power again. So their objectives are different. And the United States keeps straddling multiple scenarios and objectives. So that's where my head is at the moment.
Thank you. Dalia, over to you.
Great. Well, again, thanks, Marie, and really also very happy to be with Huss and Dan and reunite with people have not seen in a while. Unfortunate circumstances, but still good to see everyone, and I appreciate the invitation. It's overwhelming. We're 4 days in. I think, what strikes me most, having just written this book on nearly half a century of U.S. hostility with Iran, and I think a very important point to step back to understand is we've never been at this moment. So with all the lessons of 47 years, we never got to this point, and we never got to this point for this reason, because all of the risks that we worried about having a direct war with Iran that says, we've confronted each other, but in all different indirect ways, naval arena, shadow war, and so forth, but attacking their territory never started until the June 25 war that Huss referenced. And now a full front assault, an expansive, as you said, Marie, a bit surprising how expansive this war is, seemingly to regime change. Now, even with the shifting targets, the target set itself suggests regime change ambitions. When you knock out the top leadership, including the supreme leader, this fundamental symbol of the revolution, and not just a political leader, but a Shia cleric, a religious leader, this is a really big deal. So, first point is we've never been here. So, any other lessons from the past? This is new territory. I think that's one critical point to keep in mind is context. The other one is exactly what both of you would have already said, which is the confusion of the goals. What are we doing here? And the I just think to normalize changing a military mission within 4 days when we have the most military forces deployed that had, for granted, we're not launching a ground invasion, but this is an immense military campaign. 6 US servicemen have been killed. Our embassies and consulates are under attack.
Is that
U.S.
Wi-Fi or mine?
citizen was regime change in the first announcement on Saturday. Rise up. Oh, am I back?
You're good. Yes, you're back. I'm so sorry.
Okay, sorry.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes, you're back.
I'm abroad now, so sorry. Well, I don't know where I got in my excitement about how it important what a major campaign this is, and the disconnect between that we're trying to achieve. So if it's you'll rise up and Iranian people, you'll finish the job, and 4 days later it's not clear, or now all of a sudden he got the message that's not maybe likely to happen, and how are unarmed protesters supposed to do that, unify opposition, etc. So now we're to degrade the military. And so this leads me to my last point, which is, where do we go? And I think the way this war ends is going to be Trump's decision. The Iranians just want to survive. If the regime, an asymmetric war, which is what's happening here, Iran just needs to survive. The Iranian leadership in some form needs to survive to declare victory. What is success for President Trump? What is success for this administration? How many lives do we need to see lost? How much degradation of the military? What is the final end state? And again, and I think Huss is right, that may or may not be different between US and Israel. But the fact that we don't have answers to this and we're fully in this major military operation is frankly alarming. So that's just, that's where I'm standing. I'm a bit alarmed on day 4.
Thank you so much. And I should say, and Dan, then I'm coming to you. I think I don't want to speak for all of us, but I think all of us would agree that we would eventually someday like to see a democratic free Iran. That there's no sympathy here for the Supreme Leader or the Islamic Republic and what they have done both to their citizens, as we've seen so devastatingly these past few months, or of course, people in the region, Americans, etc. I think the question we're all grappling with is how does this war lead us to something different? Does it? Can it? Among many questions. Dan, over to you for your initial thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, Marie. And again, great to be with Huss and Dahlia, two preeminent experts in the region. So I think our audience is really getting a wonderful cross-section of super smart views in this discussion. And that's a credit to you, Marie, for curating this group. So look, you asked me, where is my head at in this moment, right? I mean, it's in a few different places. First and foremost, it's with people. It's with people in Iran. It's with people in Israel. It's with people across the region. It's with the families of the American service members who were deployed and those who were killed and injured. The human impact of conflict is something that's always forefront at my mind. And I think back to experiences in government where I traveled to places like Afghanistan and otherwise, and you get a sense of the immense impact on a region of war, right? And so I wonder what the impact will be on the future of Iran and the region as a result of this conflict, right? I mean, it will evolve and change in ways that we can't predict. And Dahlia, I thought you really put your finger on it, right? This moment is unprecedented, right? And so I think we've all been in the business at some form or fashion of trying to predict where things go. And it's very unsettling to be in a moment where you have a sense of what the ladder of escalation can look like. And in my view, the US has sort of taken a hammer down the middle of the ladder and broken all the rungs, right? We're now in a place where we're at the top of the line because the president defined the goals of the operation as being regime change from the beginning. And so even as people like the Secretary of Defense and others have tried to walk back the objectives to be more tied to a set of military specific goals, the precedent has been set from the front end. And so I said this on Saturday, and I'll say it again now. I don't know what incentive the Supreme Leaders, team, those who continue to live, have to walk back, right? Like their goal right now is to exact costs on the region and costs on the United States to make clear that they're still a force to be reckoned with, right? So that brings me to the second set of things I'm thinking about right now, and that's markets, right? It's economic markets, it's energy markets. I mean, the Iranians have made very clear that they have the capability, expertise, and willingness to hit oil and natural gas tankers going through the Straits of Hormuz, right? So that's a huge impact on global energy markets, and it's a huge impact not just on the United States, but on Russia and China, on others, who are prominent world players. And so you can imagine that as this conflict continues to drag on, if it goes for weeks or even months, which I don't think is out of the question, although I think we can discuss what we think the length of time that this is going to last should be. I think that's one to put on the list. There's going to be real pressure on the United States to find an off-ramp. And, we've all seen the reports that the administration is already reaching out to the Iranians to discuss off-ramps, right? But as I said, the Iranians have no incentive right now to back off. What they want to make clear is that they're a dangerous adversary to be reckoned with still, even as the United States and the Israelis have been able to be incredibly tactically effective at degrading Iranian military infrastructure. And as Huss and Dalia both said, that started back in June. So my thoughts are really on the markets, because I think now we're just starting to see how, as this drags out, U.S. financial markets are going to be impacted, right? Like at opening, the S&P 500 dropped 1.5% right away. And I haven't checked the final trading number, but I can imagine it's down a little bit more. Oil prices are up $7 or $10 a barrel day over day, right? That's only going to continue the longer that people perceive that Iranian supply is going to be disrupted. And so I think it's something that we have to think about. Like, what are the geoeconomic shocks that are going to reverberate far beyond the Middle East, right? And so the third place where my thoughts are right now is sort of on what the strategic end state that we're actually trying to achieve here. I mean, at any rate, the sort of changing of the goal from out and out regime change to certain military degrading objectives makes me wonder if there's an active debate and discussion inside of the administration, even now, about what the off ramp inside of the US government is. And if that's really the case, then it's sort of unsurprising that the president would come out and say something like, well, this operation went so quickly that we didn't have a plan to get Americans out of the region in place, right? Which, as a former State Department person who spent a lot of time thinking about these kinds of questions, was like deeply troubling to me, because leaving aside the question of whether you support this operation and you think it was the right thing to do, if you're going to execute a military operation of this scope and scale, you have non-combatant evacuation plans in place and you're ready to execute them, and you're thinking about how you're going to close your embassies and you're putting them on order of departure so that families can leave. And right now, all those people are exposed to the sort of flashing out of the regime's drone and missile strikes, right? And we're seeing it all over the region. We were talking just before we came on about the fact that consulates all over the region and embassies all over the region are being hit and closed down. And so my real thinking is on sort of what comes next. And if I had to draw out an overarching emotion or feeling for you, Maria, it would be fear, because this is something that the United States and Iran can't necessarily control, because we're going to be locked for some period of time in this cycle of strike and counter that's going to be very hard to step off of. So that's really where my head's at the last few days. Hope that's helpful.
Yes, definitely. And just to give folks, I know not everyone is as glued to X or Blue Sky or CNN as I think maybe the four of us are. The U.S. consulate in Dubai just hit, confirmed in the last several hours by an Iranian drone, followed on the U.S. Embassy in Riyadh yesterday. Americans from 16 countries and territories in the region have now been told to leave immediately, but there's not a lot of ways to leave right now. And oil prices up across the country, an average of 11 cents per gallon just in the last 24 hours. So interesting numbers to think about. We have questions starting to stream in, and a lot of them actually mirror some of the things I was going to ask. So I want to start first with the future of the regime. A lot of people have talked for a long time about regime change in Iran and how in the 47 years since the revolution, how that has been a goal of a lot of Americans and Gulf leaders and Israelis, certainly, and others. President Trump today in comments to the press said the worst outcome would be that whoever takes over Iran could be as bad as their predecessors. He also said that some of the people they were looking at to be future leaders have actually been killed in strikes. So some of the folks that they had looked at as future leaders no longer able to do that. And a lot of people thinking about Venezuela, where they decapitated the leadership in arresting Maduro, but elevated the vice president in a fairly clean um, line of succession, right? But that's not what a lot of people want with Iran. They want something totally different. So, an open question to all of you: what are the most likely, any of you or all of you, what are the most likely scenarios that you see for the future of the regime? Is it same regime, new faces? Is there a possibility for some kind of evolution of the regime? I would guess that none of you think protesters are going to all of a sudden be able to take over the regime without having sort of an armed opposition force. But what do you think is the most likely scenario for the future of the regime coming out during and coming out of this war? Whoever would like to start. Dahlia, do you want to start?
Sure. Although I think Hassan others, look at the domestic Iran war, but I'll tackle it from the Venezuela model because I think what I'll do is say what it's not likely to be, and then be asking to tell us a better
Perfect.
future. And Marie, I think your earlier point is so key. I mean, everybody, no one is going to mourn the loss of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Okay, that is clear, and we all would like to see the same endpoint of free democratic Iran. Now, this gets to the Venezuela model because clearly President Trump, the Trump administration, was perfectly fine for an outcome in Venezuela that was not a democratic and free Venezuela. It did not bring in the opposition and elections. It brought in within the regime, and nothing else has changed. The reason this is not the same is that there is no clear candidate to replace Adelsi. This is not like something was cooked up unless there's things going on behind the scenes that we don't know about. But as far as I know, we didn't kill the top leadership in Venezuela. I think some bodyguards were killed, and Maduro and his wife, exactly two people, were taken out of the country. This is a very different situation, a country of 90 million, a very entrenched leadership where it is not just centralized in one spot as much as we focused on the supreme leader. And Hassan, others can speak to this more. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is designed to protect this regime. There's a lot at stake. And you're seeing everyone around you from the top, the very top, getting killed by the hour. And you have to wonder what the incentive would be to so-called lay down your arms and do America's bidding. It's just not looking like it's in the cards. So it's a very, very different model. And though, if anybody had those expectations, and in one interview, President Trump suggested several times that Venezuela would be a good model, right?
Mhm.
So that's clear. Democracy was not high on his list in Iran either. And so, if that would be the case, it's pretty detached from reality, I think, in terms of the circumstances on the ground. What the alternatives are, I'm going to pass it over to Huss for the
And just
tougher question.
well, just to follow up on that, it's so interesting.
Yeah,
I thank you for mentioning the offer that President Trump gave for them to lay down their arms. First, I would ask, who are they supposed to lay them down to? There are
yeah.
no American troops that I know of in Iran. It's interesting. I think he or someone on his team more likely took a lesson from Iraq and de-Baathification when we did not give the Iraqi military, especially at lower levels, widespread immunity, which eventually was part of what turned into the insurgency. But there's no one to lay down their arms to.
And
Uh,
can I just
of
say one
course.
thing, Marie? Because what
Yeah.
you're also raising is, I think, two of you have worked at the State Department. I mean, you've been in the government and you understand the importance of expertise. I mean, this is suggesting to me, this is another reason for worry, that what kind of expertise is rising to the top to be, advising on the kind of outcomes you could expect, to be explaining the differences between the Iraq model. So it feels like there's lessons being learned in this very haphazard way and very inaccurate way that are not going to be serving our interest in terms of trying to do something that will actually help the people in Iran, which is what was supposed to be the start of this whole thing when President Trump came out of the gate with his social media posting, help is on the way. Where have we gone from that point? And so this is, I think your reflections really underscore concern about what's happening with the professionalization of our government right now. And as foreign policy analysts, this is really concerning.
So, Huss, what are the likely or possible scenarios for who replaces the supreme leader? We or the government leaders in general. We also saw media reporting today the Israelis have claimed to kill a number of leaders who had met to pick the new supreme leader. So they are
Yeah.
continuing quite aggressive leadership strikes against the Iranian regime.
Yeah. So first, I want to echo everything Dahlia said. I think it's remarkable that arguably the most major war of the first quarter of the 21st century, and remember, this is Iran. This is not Iraq. It's not a rigid Ba'ath party. Um, but having gone through the lessons of Afghanistan and Iraq and still following through like this, you're in the midst of this massive war, and the policy process side of this is absent. It's a remarkable moment. I don't think in American foreign policy history there's a precedent for it. Certainly not in the post-Second World War period. The United States has always had plans and preferences for what types of governments, what kind of individuals, deep intelligence on possible leadership profiles from during the Cold War, all the way up to invasion of Iraq and after. And so the fact that this administration is proceeding with just a basic lack of care for what the implications and consequences are of their kind of a lackadaisical, haphazard approach is really remarkable. So on the Iran side, there is a constitutional process. The Islamic Republic of Iran is still the official government and in charge. They have a constitution that gives them a roadmap of how to follow on with the leadership process. So, the president, a member of the Guardian Council, and the head of the judiciary have
And the
formed
president's still alive. President's still
and
alive.
he's still alive, Pezeshkian. Those three are part of a caretaker group that has started the process of transition, and it's kind of jointly occupying that role of the leader until the Assembly of Experts, which is a kind of a House of Lords, if you will, of theologians who would meet and vote and elect the next supreme leader. And the Iranian foreign minister said that decision should be coming within days because of the crisis that the country's in. They need to have a leader very quickly. The names of candidates are too numerous. I don't know, frankly, how many of them are alive to be even considered at this point. But I wouldn't be surprised that this time around we're going to see someone remarkably different from the last two, Khomeini and Khamenei, precisely because the structure of power in Iran has become so much more entrenched along security lines. I mean, the Revolutionary Guards, for all intents and purposes, are now in charge of the country. If they weren't before, reports from a third to two-thirds of the economy of Iran is under their control anyway. And now in a security situation like this, obviously the guards, which are very diffuse, have diffuse leadership structure, are the command and control of the country for now. So whoever emerges will have to be favored by the guards.
And the guards who are, for those in our audience who aren't as familiar with the IRGC, responsible for much of the carnage that we've seen in the region, and certainly not reformers by any stretch of the imagination.
Yes, and I should say they've cut their teeth. They were born out of a very entrenched conventional war with Iraq, the 8 years of war with Iraq. So crisis is how they thrive and how they maneuver in. In fact, that's kind of like their raison d'etre to continually keep the country in crisis to justify their kind of state of emergency posture. So I can't tell you exactly who's going to be in charge, but I do think there is a higher likelihood that, especially given that there's no commitment of troops on the ground, there's no process to install or foresee or help bring about elections or have a transitional government or what have you, someone from within these ranks is going to emerge, and we're going to get a rebranding of the Islamic Republic at some level, either rebranded along much more hostile securitized terms, or as something that has become so neutered and unimportant that is just there kind of governing territory. I can tell you this, that I think the Israeli objectives here are at odds with the United States. That Israel very much likes to see this ideology. Benjamin Netanyahu has said it's not just the nuclear weapons, it's the ideology of the state that wants to see the end of the state of Israel to be eradicated. They want a government that does not pursue the kinds of policies the Iranian government has pursued with respect to Hezbollah, with respect to Palestinian resistance groups, and in terms of support for militias and proxies across the region. The Arab countries would like to see a government that is not, going to kind of emerge into a hegemon again. Other countries get a vote in this as well. And then on top of all this, I think there's the Iranian people. I don't think we should estimate a nation of 90 million people that have really risked their lives over and over again, taken to the streets to at some point perhaps exert their voice as well. That's obviously the hope of many in the diaspora, that the Iranian public takes to the streets and takes over ministries and offices that are perhaps been knocked over. There's no leadership structure left, and you start to see the beginning of a kind of a grassroots bottom up. But if history is any guide, chances of that succeeding and leader emerging from that are very slim.
Thank you so much, Dan. I'm sort of going through the questions that are being asked in the chat as we have this conversation. You've spent so much time thinking about the Gulf region and Israel. And for those of us who care deeply about the security of the state of Israel and the Gulf countries, this is also a bit of an unprecedented moment. Iran has clearly decided they want to inflict pain on our friends and allies in the region. And we have some questions related to how the Gulf states might play a role in de-escalating or pressuring the sides to come to the table. We also have a question about whether the U.S. Navy could successfully escort commercial tankers through the Strait of Hormuz, right? What's happening there? And so I'd love your thoughts on the regional piece of this. I think for a lot of people, Americans and others, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Doha, these were places they felt very safe living. They did not feel on a day-to-day basis the tension between Israel and Iran in the same way that Beirut does, or of course, Yemen does. So obviously a very broad region, but when you look around at the different countries, how are they responding and how might they play a role in what happens next?
Yeah, I mean, let me take the de-escalation question first, Marie. Look, I think you've seen historic damage that's been done to the relationship that Iran will have with these countries. The piercing of the veil that you talked about just now with the strikes in places like Dubai and Abu Dhabi and Doha. And I should say Doha experienced a small taste of this in June after the Midnight Hammer strikes. So it's not so new for them, but the scope and scale of what's occurred is very new, right? And that's a real, I think, come to Jesus moment for a lot of people, both in the region and people who work in the region, right? And who think about Dubai and Abu Dhabi as centers of international finance and exchange and trade. I can imagine that international businesses are thinking twice at this moment in time about headquartering new operations there, expanding and engaging. To an extent, that extends to Riyadh also, although Riyadh is more entrenched, safer. I mean, I wonder what Dahlia and Huss think about what this will mean for Saudi Arabia and its position in the region, because they're the biggest animal in the room, if you will.
And its relationship with Israel,
yeah,
right?
Of course,
Developing relationship with Israel.
That's right. We haven't talked at all about the Abraham Accords and what might happen to the Abraham Accords. I mean, I think there's a very interesting discussion to be had about whether Iran, in wanting to inflict costs, will push Arab states that have been very reluctant to engage at all with Israel into potentially expanding their partnerships underneath the Abraham Accords umbrella, because of the security relationships that are possible there and what they've seen the Israelis be able to accomplish against a country in Iran that's proven that it's willing to lash out in ways that it never has before, right? I mean, and this gets back to Dahlia's earlier point about the lack of precedents for this moment, right? There are so many unexpected sort of consequences, right? It's really the ultimate butterfly effect kind of conversation. And then thinking about the question of de-escalation, look, I think Oman in particular must feel very burned at this moment in time. And
they've said that. right?
Yeah, right, exactly. And burned just as much by the Iranians as it does by the United States, right? Because I can't imagine that the United States telegraphed its intentions that effectively if the Omani foreign minister was in Washington on Friday trying to make the case to the vice president in person that there's a deal to be had here, right? And he's out there in public with very forward-leaning rhetoric. Again, wonder what how Dahlia and Huss think about what the Gulfies were telegraphing about where the talks were going. And so I think they're going to be pretty reluctant to get into the middle of this, especially in the early days. Now, if it drags out into weeks and months, the Qataris and the Omanis are the most likely places where you could see good offices being used between Iran and the United States to de-escalate, right? But that also requires the Iranians in particular to be willing to find an off-ramp, and I just don't see that, not for the next little while.
And what about the Strait of Hormuz? So can you say
Yes,
a couple
sorry,
of
on
about that?
escort, yes.
Yeah.
So
Or what
look,
might happen there, what
Mhm.
impact that would have if the Iranians shut it down and we actually can't get tankers through.
Yeah, look, so from an operational perspective, could the United States set up a tanker escort? Sure, it absolutely could. I think the costs in terms of personnel and equipment, material that would be damaged, destroyed, or otherwise rendered inoperable would be very, very high because the Iranians have spent a generation investing in anti-access and area denial technology that makes them very operationally capable and effective of shutting down the straits. So you could see the opportunity to go in and do something there that tries to get tankers through, but I think it becomes operationally extremely costly for the United States and therefore politically very costly. So I think it's entirely possible you could do it, but the likelihood of success limited. And so what that means for markets, there's no overland alternative, right? There are no natural gas or oil pipelines that credibly recreate what goes through the Straits of Hormuz on tankers every day. So there's a major global crisis in terms of both access to cheap energy and also what it means for economic markets, right? Stock markets and financial trading across the world. As people start to look at these futures and the prices going through the roof, there's immediate macroeconomic impacts globally.
Dahlia?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, this discussion of Straits of Hormuz and reflagging ships, all of this, there are some precedents to this because we did have a tanker war with the Iranians in the late 80s, and that didn't end so well and led to lots of miscalculations, including the shoot down of a civilian airplane. So again, all of these forms of escalation, I think very important to note, can lead to very unintended consequences. And what now, looks like maybe it can be controlled or we could figure out an off-ramp, it can move in directions that we might not predict. I just want to add one thing on the regional dimension, though. I think Dan is right. Iran might have, I'd be interested in has too, but Iran might have miscalculated by pushing, the envelope in terms of provoking its partners in the Gulf, hosted Iran, other stories, and so forth is quite a blow. But at the same time, I think we should recognize there's enormous resentment in the region to the United States putting these countries in this position. And they were actively lobbying against this war because they were predicting these outcomes would happen. They don't want to be in the crosshairs. In fact, when Saudi Arabia was attacked, Saudi Aramco was attacked in 2019 after Trump left the nuclear deal in 2018 and Iran lashed out on oil facilities. This was a big blow to the Saudis. And interestingly, in that time, and now is probably quite different, but at that time, that was the beginning of the Saudis starting to move away from this very strong leadership in an anti-Iran front toward reconciliation with the Iranians, rapprochement. I agree. We're not likely to see that again. On the other hand, I think there's going to be a lot of questioning about what is U.S. basing getting these countries. It's supposed to deter attacks, not invite them. So again, it's raising a lot of questions about the future of U.S. relationships with these partners that I think will be very long-standing.
I think that's a good, thank you for that. I think that's a good transition now to some of the more direct military questions. So just putting a few things on the table, and we have a number of questions related to this that I will read. So in terms of the military aspects of this conflict, the Trump administration has said they are going after the nuclear program, which of course they attacked last June. They said it had been obliterated. Clearly, it had not been. It is, although they haven't struck it yet in this war, as far as I know. They are aggressively attacking ballistic missile facilities and launch sites, particularly because they are trying to take away Iran's ability to launch missiles. They are attacking Iran's navy, they have said. and trying to take away its ability to support terrorist actors in the region. We've also seen on the United States side, President Trump yesterday said we may have to start moving some assets from the Pacific region, assets that are designed to deal with China, to the Middle East. General Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs yesterday, said we may have to send more troops to the Middle East to deal with this. And we've heard reports from our partners in the region that they are quickly running out of interceptor weapons that they've had to use quite a lot of to ensure that those missiles don't actually do a lot of damage in their countries. So that's sort of the military picture as we see it today. The questions we're getting asked are about, was there an imminent threat? Is it, if it's missiles and nukes, this is the same rhetoric we've heard from a long time. I think missiles are more of a realistic threat than the nuclear program. They do not have nuclear weapons like North Korea or Pakistan or other countries do. But when we're talking about the missiles, can anyone speak to sort of Iran's missile production timelines and capacity? What's the difference between missiles and these drones we've seen Iran use quite a lot of? What are, replacement rates? I know none of us, I think, are actually military hardware experts, but basically, do we have a sense for how long before both sides sort of run out of armaments or will need to do something drastic to rearm? I don't know, Dan, if you have thoughts on this and want to take that first.
Yeah, I'd love to come in on the question of how long this goes. I mean, I think it's also tied to a conversation we should have about the impact on U.S. defense posture globally, because if
Exactly.
I am China, I want this conflict to go on as long as possible because it degrades the U.S.'s capability to support its partners in the region and leaves Taiwan and other countries in and around the South China Sea open to all kinds of Chinese intervention, right? So I think, using up terminal high altitude air defense or THAAD missiles to shoot down Iranian ballistic missiles, right? There are a limited supply of those, and the supply chain for that is really long. The same thing for the kind of Tomahawk standoff cruise missiles that the United States used in the initial set of strikes on the first day, right? Like there are only a certain number of those in existence. It's hard to build them. I mean, I've read reports that the United States is going to buy anywhere from 50 to 60 of those in a given year. I mean, how many of those do we even use up between June and now, right? And how does that impact our defense posture and planning vis-a-vis Taiwan contingencies, right? So I think like that to me gets back to this whole question of I've seen reporting, and this seems credible to me, that the United States is prepared for 7 to 10 days of air operations, and then there's a refit and rearm period. And so that seems credible to me. The question I don't know the answer to is how and what the Israelis have in their stockpile and how much they can continue this. I mean, I've read reporting, and again, this is in the public, so take it with a grain of salt, that the Israelis are flying 500 sorties a day, right? And so that implies like a pretty active ongoing air campaign to hit a whole host of targets. And I think, Marie, you've got the right panoply of what they're trying to hit. But that begs the question of like, how long can they keep this going? And if the goal for the Israelis is really to change the ideology, you're not going to do that through airstrikes. And they might find after several weeks of really high operational tempo that their stocks are exhausted. And the United States, at the same time, who's been the principal supplier of precision munitions that the Israelis have, is trying to refill its own stocks because of what it's tried to do in the region, right? And so I think there's a real question there around, and it gets back to the discussion we've been having about strategic aims. Because if you have a clear sense of your strategic aims, you understand like, okay, we're going to reach a point where the ends don't justify the means because of the impact on broader U.S. defense policy and strategy and posture questions. So I hope that's helpful in terms of sort of contextualizing where we are on the military side of things right now.
Anything, Hester Dalia, to add to that before I move on?
I can quickly comment on Iran's missile and drone programs. I mean, I maybe differ with some analysts on this in that I actually think Iranian capabilities don't matter much in this picture. All they have to do is survive and absorb hits. So Iranian missile program, from everything I've read, close to 70-75% of it has been completely hit, and we won't have good credible numbers on this. I mean, the drones that they're kind of launching are kind of it's a sign of just how undisciplined and kind of lackadaisical the Iranian side of this is. So the Iranian capabilities don't matter; they're outmatched anyway. The point is that can they wear out Washington's patience and supplies? And supplies will also get replenished by Washington. I have to we have to be this is a major military power. It's going to come back. Maybe it will take some time off, etc. But they're okay if this turns into whack-a-mole, because they look at. I mean, look in the case of Taliban. Okay, you're talking about people with zero capability. They're back in power after 20 years, right? You look at Iraq and all the money and equipment and everything spent over there, right? And it has an entirely different outcome than what Washington pre-planners in 2003 had thought about. So Iranians are very adept at this. They understand, they're on a different timeline than Washington is. And I want to kind of bring and underline this point over and over again here that, look, the independent variable in all of this is Donald Trump. A lot of this stuff comes down to what does he want out of this? Well, I think it's very clear that what he wants for Iran is an afterthought. He doesn't think in those terms. What do I want for Iran, Iranian people? Just has not entered anyone's calculations. The decision to commence this war and to prosecute it in the way that he is, it's remarkable. I mean, it comes down to his son-in-law and his golf partner being the interlocutors, the last ones to sort of say, determined, neither of them Senate confirmed, who decided that, negotiations are going nowhere. And the Iranians are aware of this, that this is at odds with, millions of people working in the Pentagon, people in the bureaucracy, et cetera. The patience of all these other people is going to wear out at some point. And they're calculating, they're just going to wait out and see if the narrative turns on Donald Trump.
I'm going back to our previous conversation briefly because I do want to ask this question because I think other people will have it. Nobody mentioned Reza Pahlavi when they were talking about potential options for what might come in Iran. For those who don't know, he's the son of the late Shah who has lived in the United States since they fled Iran. And he's been quite public. You follow him on Instagram. You can see him speaking to the people of Iran. The Trump administration seems to have at first tried to embrace him as potentially someone they could send back to Iran in a leadership role, but President Trump has seemed to distance himself a little bit from him. Some people in the diaspora seem to be a fan and seem to think he may be a potential leader, but a lot of people I think are skeptical given how long he's been outside of the country. Anyone want to comment on Pahlavi? Don't all jump in at once. Huss, would you like to?
Maybe I'll say something. I mean, I think he has emerged as the kind of the most recognizable name of the opposition. He has a steadfast following among monarchists and others who've come on board since over the course of the last 2-3 years. He has expanded his media appearances. There's clearly a strategy that he's put forward for the future, the transition of the country. They have a document. He's very clearly favored by the Israeli government. He's traveled there. He's mentioned that, on day one, Iran would become a strategic ally of Israel, no longer an enemy, etc. He said all these things, but he seems to continually get dismissed by Donald Trump. And as far as I know, also Arab leaders are very wary of a return of another Pahlavi. His father was not someone that the Arab monarchies looked to with comfort because they thought Iran overshadowed their relationship with Washington. And so I think the strategic calculus on the part of Saudi Arabia especially, and I want to highlight here what the Saudis say publicly is very different from what they say privately. And on the reporting that I've seen is that privately they were pushing for this war very much before, at least MBS was. They would like to see
leader Mohammed bin Salman.
Sorry. Right. Sorry. Yes, the crown prince in Saudi Arabia. So I think from their standpoint, I think they've made it clear to Washington too that Pahlavi is not someone necessarily that they favor, and probably the way they pitch it to say, look, he's been away 47 years. He would have to start from scratch. That didn't work out with Ahmad Chalabi, let alone with someone who was overthrown in a revolution. So don't go there. And I think Trump seems to be listening to that so far.
So I have two quick sort of lightning round questions, and then I have a bigger picture question I'd love all of you to answer before we break for the afternoon. The first is a lot of people are asking who about the question of whether this is illegal. I don't think anyone on here is a lawyer, but I'm not, to correct me if I'm wrong. And about the question of congressional approval. Both the House and the Senate will vote this week on war powers resolutions. Nobody expects them to pass. And if they somehow would, I think President Trump would veto such a resolution. But does anybody have any thoughts about the legality of this war? We're getting a lot of questions about that. Yep, Dan?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'll answer it this way, Marie. You know, the framers of the United States Constitution created Article 1 and imbued Congress with the power to declare war for a reason. Now, I will also say that Article 2, and again, I'm not a lawyer, but I've been around enough of them in the course of my career to know, and especially in conversations around the use of force, that Article 2 is very flexible when it comes to self-defense. And so I'm not reading the classified legal justification that the administration is required to provide to Congress in these kinds of situations, but I can guess that there is a way to draw an Article 2 rationality. So as far as U.S. domestic law, I'm sure there's a way to find their way to legality. Does that mean that the political case of an authorization for the use of military force is not incredibly important? No, I think it is very important, right? And I do think there's a real need when U.S. leaders decide to use force, especially in this kind of manner, to make a credible case to the American people about the strategic rationale. That's why all of us are so, I think, unsettled about where this could go, because the strategic rationale is shifting. There is no case comprehensively for war that's been made by anyone, to my mind. And if Dalian has disagreed, please welcome your weighing in there, right? But I don't hear in any of the conversations that I've seen in public from administration officials that sort of coherent, clear, imminent threat rhetoric that I think would make you feel like, okay, whether I disagree or not about the personal technique of using military force to achieve these stated objectives, that a clear imminent threat that deserved action was there in place. That doesn't mean that it couldn't have existed, but it hasn't been briefed to the American people. And it's really, really important that you do things like that in these kinds of situations because of the implications of what it means to go to war. As I talked about, where my head has been on thinking about people in the region and elsewhere about how the impacts of people of war.
Thank you for that. And yes, there are two legal justifications people will point to. One is the constitutional Article 1 versus Article 2, as you so well laid out. And the other is the War Powers Act, which, if there is an imminent threat, the president can act and then notify Congress within 60 days. That's why the question of imminent is so important here. Before I get to my last overall question, just very briefly, a lot of people asking for other good sources, news sources, writers, reporters who are really good on the conflict, on Iran. Any recommendations anyone has for ways people can keep up on what's happening in Iran or the conflict, besides, of course, joining our wonderful events here at Perry World House? Any suggestions? I'm happy to
Yeah.
give them, but Dan, why don't you start?
Yeah, I've got a couple. I think Holly Dagres at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy is really, really good on thinking about the Iranian street and seems to have her finger on the pulse of what's going on. And the other person that I think does that very well and also understands regime dynamics is Ali Vaya's International Crisis Group, showing my personal
I know.
bias there. But I think they're both great and actually have a sense of what's happening on the ground with the Iranian street in a way that is really important in this moment to actually understand what's going on the ground inside of the country. And then Raz Zimmit at INSS on the Israeli perspective, I think is also very, very good.
Dahlia?
Yeah, I think I would individuals going beyond the individual issue because there are many and it is hard to sift through all of that. There's a lot of diversity of views. But I do think, the good news sources that I turn to quite a bit are actually FT has been, I think, top of my list at doing just really great investigative reporting. And unfortunately, US media outlets and right before this happened, the Washington Post fired all of their international correspondents. So you can't look to US papers the same way as you used to. And second to FT, I would say would be, for all of our complaints on the New York Times, they probably still do have the most comprehensive coverage in terms of a U.S. outlet. And then, coming from Israel, I think, institutions like INSS, ARTS is quite good. And Huss, I'll let you talk to Arab World or things coming out of Iran that we should be looking at.
Yeah, I agree with all the sources. I mean, FT unfortunately also is not a cheap subscription. So if you have an institutional subscription, that's probably your best way in. In terms of what's coming out of Iran, honestly, a lot of it gets refracted through Iranian social media
Hmm.
personalities now, because in terms of publications, they're non-operating, and because of the internet blackouts, you can't really get good information. You have to wait for things to get verified, etc. But there's no shortage of Substacks I refer to. Laura Rosen is also very good and talks to good sources and um, uh, around Washington as well. I would make a pitch here for actually keeping it simple and monitor wire services. AP and Reuters are, they're working hard at just telling you what's happening. Analysis oftentimes is, given how fast things are shifting and how whimsical decision making is in Washington, D.C., can really be off the point. And I would include my own analysis in this category as well. We're all trying to basically sift through what's happening at any given moment, but knowing actually what's happening is more important than
Right.
I think perspectives on what's happening right now. And wire services for me it's what I'm checking most.
Thank you. I know we only have a few minutes left, but we may take a few extra minutes. So please, I'd love for our audience to stick with us. I want to ask a last general question, and it's reflected in a lot of the questions we're getting from the audience. For those of us who've been following Iran for many years, studying Iran for many years, um, there have been debates in the United States about how best to contain Iran's bad behavior, right? None of us are naive about Iran's support for terrorism, terrorist groups, Iran's attacks on American soldiers serving in Iraq, through their proxies and through their weapons they built. None of us are naive about that. I worked for an administration that believed in diplomacy, and we thought diplomacy could be used to solve big challenges, that we could somehow constrain Iran, put them in a box, chip away at their power, take away the nuke program. Um, that's what we thought was the best course of action. The nuclear program certainly halted under the deal, but other nefarious activity continued. So I don't think anyone can claim to have cracked the code on how to deal with Iran prior to the war. I think all of us have deep concerns about the point of the war, the objectives of the war, the conduct of the war, but how going forward, how should we, if you were advising President Trump or whoever the next president of the United States is, coming out of this, how do we constrain Iran's nefarious activity? What should the relationship look like? It's a huge question, and I know we're almost at four, but I'd love for each of you to say something about that. Like, if you, what coming out of this, what might this relationship look like? Because we can't just bomb them forever. We can't just keep doing this every 6 months. I mean, certainly people can try, but that's not a recipe for success in any way. So, whoever would like to start us off, Dahlia, you're unmuted, so I'm going to go to you first.
Oh,
I
okay.
know it's,
That's a dangerous thing.
I know, I
Uh,
know.
you know, well, I think it's a great question because we have had relatively similar policies for nearly half a century now, and it hasn't made Iran less dangerous and less problematic, and it hasn't helped support the Iranian people. So, but I wonder if I would flip the question instead of negative terms, what can we do to prevent them from? I think we need to also think more constructively about how to help build a better alternative. There just hasn't been a lot of support in we're always what we need to counter and stop. And in a lot of ways, these policies have actually made things worse. All of these sanctions, very bad guys benefit from these things. They hurt the wider population. So we really need to be smarter thinking through the implications of what we're doing rather than just doing things that make us feel good so we can say we checked a box, we did something to show we're tough on Iran. Let's actually think what might translate into an opening. And here we need to have a longer game like what we did with the Soviets during the Cold War. Think about how to create an environment that shows there's a better alternative. rather than just having this vacuum that we are now seeing. This isn't going to happen overnight, but I would get back to supporting civil society and thinking about those, terms that now seem to not be very, it's nothing's getting funded in that arena in the State Department at the present time. But maybe in the future, we could get back into thinking about those kinds of instruments of diplomatic power. For the moment, we should do whatever we can to protect people, whether it's changing our visa ban policies, whether it's stopping sending Iranians back to Iran who are trying to get asylum here. We should be accepting dissidents at this moment of crisis. We need to be doing whatever we can, helping them with communications, helping civil society groups that are trying to help prevent this surveillance that regular Iranians are facing. These are the kind of things I think we haven't put enough thought into. And we always go back to kind of the default sanctions, pressure, and so forth. And those just haven't worked well.
Dan, your thoughts on what the future should look like, could look like?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really glad that Dahlia raised this question of positive inducement. I mean, look, at some level, we need to be thinking about how we present an alternative model that's more attractive to countries in the region and globally that will align them with us and not with Iran. I mean, this is one of the ways, I mean, there are so many factors that go into the fall of the Soviet Union, and I don't mean to draw an exact parallel there, but there's an ideal perspective that the Americans have always tried, we have always tried to bring, which is we're a much more prosperous, open, free, ambitious society where people can grow and learn. And it's why we spend so much time and effort on not just USAID and the kind of development activities we would do, but on Voice of America and beaming in the actual life that's happening here in this country into these places. And so I think this is a very long commitment, right? I mean, if we take it at face value that, and I do, that we're not going to ultimately change the form of government in Iran from being more authoritarian and a hard line, maybe it looks different than what the Islamic Republic has been to date, but it's still going to be authoritarian, it's still going to be hardline, it's not going to be democratic, and it's not going to be aligned with the United States. This is where fundamentally I fall out on where we're going in the next 9 months to 18 months, right? And so in that context, we're sort of like gearing up for a very long campaign of making a credible case to the countries who are Iran's closest partners still, that they are better off being aligned with the United States, right? And that's a tough road to hoe, but I do think it is possible to do. And one place I give this administration some credit is for the opening of their policy on Syria, right? I mean, it took a lot of courage for Donald Trump to meet with Ahmed al-Shara and to lift sanctions on Syria and to invest in the future of that country in the way that he has. And look, there are all kinds of other challenges replete in the future of Syria, right? But that's the kind of thing where Syria was Iran's strategic depth in the region, even more so than Hezbollah was in a lot of ways. I wonder if Dahlia and Huss would disagree with that point. But to me, the idea that you could pull away one of Iran's strategic assets is an amazing opportunity. And we've tied our own hands without USAID or any of the other traditional tools that we would use to build up the state in a place like Syria, right? And so we're constrained, but at least we're trying. Right. And so that's the kind of thing that we're going to have to do to take this thing in a better direction, in my opinion.
And Huss, finishing with you, one of the premises of diplomacy with Iran was that if we could make deals they would stick to, it was good even if the regime never changed. But maybe if the Iranian regime could be shown that cooperating with the United States, sticking to a deal, they give us something, we give them something, could possibly portend a different relationship in the future. And we should remind our participants, we still don't have an embassy in Tehran. We had an embassy in Moscow throughout the entire Cold War. So the people-to-people ties, the diplomatic ties, I mean, this is a country that we just for so long have not had basic communications with. So I wonder, sitting here today, what you think that future could look or should look like.
So I'll speak as an Iranian American here. I do think foreign policy objectives geared at individual countries are kind of branches of a singular national security strategy tree. And I think the United States oftentimes has the best foreign policy when it approximates most closely its democratic constitutional principles. And that it's remarkably empirically provable when you go back, is that the more transparent, the more law-abiding, the administration in Washington is, the better it conducts itself globally and looks after American national interests. And I think in an environment like that, countries that have ill intentions get singled out and alienated and dealt with in a cooperative fashion with the global community as a whole. It doesn't become your problem; it becomes everyone else's problem. And Iran was in that box for a couple of decades before things started to shift after 9/11 and with American national security posture toward the rest of the world. Now, I know that's a very kind of a dramatic and idealized way of putting it, because you have to deal with the world as it is on a daily basis. But I say this because I want to underline what I said earlier, that the current administration is the independent variable here. Iran is a bad actor, yes. All these other portfolios that are problematic exist around the world, but everyone is responding to Washington. The node of unpredictability is in Washington, is not in these places anymore. When I started studying U.S.-Iran relations, I was oftentimes counseled to demystify Iran because it was so opaque and difficult to figure out who's making decisions on what basis, what is the reason for this move, for that move. Now you ask those questions out of Washington. You don't ask them out of Tehran. You can telegraph those decisions so much easier over there. So I'm going to really cling to this kind of dramatic, because I don't think after this war, after what started on Saturday, you can go back to the way things were. This is an entirely different dynamic now that you have to deal with. And because there is no policy process, because there is very little transparency into decision making and motives into policy making in Washington, it's because you're dealing with an administration that shoots first and aims later. You have to really start thinking, how do you get control of policy process here first before you can figure out what's good for dealing with Iran and all these other cases.
Thank you. And thank you to all of you. I feel like we could talk for 3 and 4 hours, and I know many of us have been doing so in the past few days. I have a feeling we will be getting this group back together to talk with our audience. We had a huge audience attending online, which I'm so grateful for. And I think that we are in uncharted territory, as Dahlia so perfectly put it. We have been since last June, and I am grateful to have all three of you as part of our community, helping us think through it together, helping our students and faculty and our community members think through it as well. So thank you. I am very grateful for you. I'm grateful to everyone who attended and asked questions. Please continue following us online. We'll be keeping our social media and website up to speed with commentary from all of these folks and others affiliated with Perry World House. So please keep us in mind. And like I said, I'm sure we'll be doing this again soon. So I hope everybody gets a little bit of sleep as well. I feel like it's been a strange few days, but thank you to all three of you for being with us today and to our audience.
Thanks, Marie.